Blood is supposed to be thicker than water, but in my family, status was the only currency that mattered. I spent 10 years pulling soldiers from the brink of death, only to be treated like a peasant at my sister's wedding. But her groom was about to change everything. My name is Stella, Major Stella Higgins, United States Army Medical Corps. For the past decade, my life has been measured in the rhythmic thumping of medevac helicopter rotors, the sterile smell of field hospitals, and the desperate, frantic minutes of the golden hour, that critical window where a trauma surgeon like me stands between a young soldier and a flag-draped coffin. I've operated in tents in Kandahar, stabilized blast victims in the back of moving strikers, and washed the blood of heroes off my hands more times than I can count. But, to my family, the Higgins dynasty of Newport, Rhode Island, I was just the girl who couldn't get into a proper private practice. The contrast between my world and theirs was never sharper than the week of my younger sister's wedding. Iris was the golden child, a former pageant queen turned luxury real estate agent who had somehow convinced Dr. Charles Harding, the youngest chief of orthopedic surgery at Boston General, to put a 3-carat diamond on her finger. I had just rotated back stateside from a grueling deployment at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany. I was exhausted, jet-lagged, and nursing a deep, persistent ache in my left shoulder, a souvenir from a mortar strike near my surgical tent 2 years prior. But I was the maid of honor, a title Iris bestowed upon me less out of sisterly affection and more because it fit the traditional aesthetic she was demanding for her 6-figure wedding. "Stella, please tell me you aren't planning on wearing those dreadful combat boots to the reception, my mother," Beatrice sighed the moment I stepped into the foyer of our sprawling family estate. She didn't offer a hug or say she was glad I made it home safely. Her eyes just immediately dropped to my scuffed tactical boots and my olive-drab duffel bag. "Hello to you too, Mom," I said, dropping the heavy bag onto the pristine marble floor. "And no, I brought heels. I just got off a C-17 transport plane 12 hours ago." "Well, thank goodness," she muttered, adjusting her cashmere cardigan. "Iris has been an absolute wreck. The florist ordered the wrong shade of peonies, and Charles's parents are arriving tonight. Please try to blend in, Stella. The Hardings are very old money. We don't need them thinking Iris's sister is some grunt." I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper. Grunt. That was their favorite word for me. Despite the fact that I had a medical degree from Georgetown, completed a grueling trauma residency, and commanded a forward surgical team, my parents willfully reduced my career to playing in the mud. To them, the military was for people who had no other options. "I'm a trauma surgeon, Mom. I'm an officer," I reminded her quietly, though I knew it was useless. Yes. Handing out band-aids to the troops? It's very noble." She waved her hand dismissively. "Just go upstairs and shower. Iris's dress fitting is in an hour, and you need to try on your bridesmaid gown. And Stella?" She paused, her gaze dropping to my left forearm. "Please make sure you wear the foundation I bought you. We really need to cover up that texture." She meant the burn scar, the thick, jagged, pale tissue that ran from my wrist to my elbow, earned when a medical supply generator caught fire in Kabul, and I had to drag an unconscious corpsman out of the flames. I pulled my sleeve down, my jaw tight. "Sure, Mom." Upstairs, Iris's bedroom looked like a bridal magazine had exploded. Silk ribbons, tulle, and overflowing gift boxes covered every surface. Iris was standing on a velvet pedestal, draped in a custom Vera Wang gown that probably cost more than my annual base pay. "Stella, you made it!" Iris squealed, though she didn't step down to hug me, terrified of wrinkling the silk. "Oh my God, look at your hair! Did you cut it yourself with a pocket knife?" "Standard regulations, Chloe," I said, forcing a smile. "You look beautiful." "I know," she beamed, turning to admire her profile in the trifold mirror. "Charles is going to cry when he sees me. Speaking of Charles, you really need to be on your best behavior this weekend, Stella. His colleagues are coming. Fancy doctors. Real doctors. Please don't bore them with your depressing war stories, okay? This is a happy weekend." The casual cruelty knocked the wind out of me, but I had learned long ago how to compartmentalize. "I won't say a word," I promised. She pointed to a garment bag hanging on the closet door. "Your dress is in there. I had to have the seamstress add long sleeves to it." I know it's a summer wedding, but honestly, Stella, the scar is just going to pull focus in the photos. I unzipped the bag. The dress was a heavy, suffocating mauve chiffon with tight, restrictive sleeves. It was stifling, conservative, and designed specifically to hide the parts of me my family found unsavory. I stared at the fabric, feeling the familiar, suffocating weight of my family's conditional love. It's perfect, I lied. The rehearsal dinner was held at the Newport Country Club, an exclusive venue perched on the edge of the Atlantic Ocean, dripping in old-world wealth and entitlement. The room was packed with the New England elite men in tailored linen suits and women dripping in generational pearls. I sat at table 14. Let me clarify. The maid of honor usually sits at the head table, or at least with the immediate family. But my mother, the mastermind behind the seating chart, had decided that the head table was reserved exclusively for the bridal party's couples. Since I was single, having prioritized saving lives over dating for the last decade, I was banished to a corner table near the kitchen doors, seated alongside Charles's eccentric great-aunt, a few rowdy teenage cousins, and my Uncle Richard, who was already 3 scotches deep. I watched from afar as my father stood up and clinked his crystal champagne flute. To my beautiful daughter Iris, my dad boomed, his face flushed with pride and expensive wine, and to her incredible groom, Dr. Charles Harding. When Iris told us she was marrying a doctor, I'll admit, I was thrilled. Finally, a real medical professional in the family. A smattering of polite laughter rippled through the room. My mother beamed. My cousins snickered, shooting sideways glances at my table. I felt my face burn, my grip tightening on my water glass. It was a direct, calculated insult. Uncle Richard leaned over, smelling of premium whiskey and cigars. "Don't let it get to you, kiddo," he slurred. "Your dad just respects a guy who makes real money. What do they pay you army docs anyway? Pennies and a GI Bill?" "I do fine, Uncle Richard," I said, keeping my voice level. Sure, but look at Charles. The guy drives a Porsche and has a boat docked in Martha's Vineyard. That's success. Well, you get to camp in the desert." He chuckled at his own joke, turning back to his steak. I couldn't take it anymore. The air in the room felt thick, choked with arrogance and unearned superiority. I quietly pushed my chair back, slipped out of the ballroom, and escaped onto the sweeping veranda overlooking the moonlit ocean. The cool, salty breeze hit my face, and for the first time all day, I could breathe. I leaned against the stone balustrade, closing my eyes. I thought about Sergeant Miller, a 19-year-old kid whose shattered femoral artery I had clamped with my bare hands in the back of a Black Hawk helicopter just 4 months ago. I thought about the letters his mother sent me, thanking me for giving her son a chance to walk again. That was my reality. That was my worth. But here, in this country club, I was just a joke in an ill-fitting mauve dress, hiding from the circus major. I jumped, spinning around. Standing in the shadows of one of the massive stone pillars was the groom himself, Charles Harding. He stepped into the dim light of the veranda. Up close, he was undeniably handsome, sharp jawline, perfectly styled dark hair, carrying the effortless confidence of a man who was used to being the smartest person in the room. He was holding a rocks glass, swirling the amber liquid thoughtfully. "I'm not hiding," I said, instantly defensive, straightening my posture. "Just getting some air, Charles." "It's loud in there," he agreed, stepping up to the railing beside me. We hadn't spoken much since I arrived. Every time I tried to introduce myself properly, Iris had whisked him away to meet another wealthy relative or prominent socialite. He looked at me, really looked at me, his gaze sweeping over my face before dropping to the heavy, long sleeves of my dress. Iris said, "You just got back from Germany. LRMC?" I blinked, surprised he knew the acronym for Landstuhl Regional Medical Center. "Yes. I'm stationed there currently, but I just finished a rotation downrange." "Downrange," he repeated softly. "Syria? Afghanistan?" "A bit of both over the last few years." "Must be exhausting," he said. It didn't sound condescending. It sounded strangely genuine, which threw me off guard. Before I could answer, the glass doors burst open, and my Aunt Caroline stumbled onto the patio, a half-empty martini glass in her hand. Aunt Caroline was notoriously sharp-tongued, a woman who treated insults as a competitive sport. Oh, there you are, Charles, she chirped, her eyes completely ignoring my existence. Iris is looking for you for the cake tasting. Honestly, you shouldn't be out here in the damp air. We need those brilliant surgical hands in pristine condition. She finally cast a sidelong glance at me. Stella, dear, why don't you go inside and check on the catering staff? I think they're running low on the crab puffs. I'm the maid of honor, Aunt Caroline, I said coldly, not the wedding planner. Aunt Caroline let out a high-pitched, patronizing laugh. Oh, sweetie, don't use that tone. We all know you're only here because Iris took pity on you. It's hard for a girl to find a husband when she dresses like a truck driver and plays war games all day. You should really ask Charles for some career advice. Maybe he could get you a job as a nurse in his clinic once you're done playing Jane. The silence on the veranda was deafening. The disrespect was so blatant, so absolute, that I literally felt my heart stutter in my chest. I waited for Charles to laugh, or to politely excuse himself. I expected him to align with the family. They were his people now, the high society elite. Instead, Charles's jaw tightened. He lowered his glass, his eyes flashing with a sudden dark intensity. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, Iris burst through the doors. Charles, there you are. She grabbed his arm, completely oblivious to the electric tension in the air. Come on, the photographer wants to get some candid shots of us near the ice sculpture. And Stella, Mom said, your hair is falling flat. Go fix it, please. Iris dragged him away. Charles looked over his shoulder at me as he was pulled back into the ballroom, an unreadable expression on his face. I stood alone on the veranda, the sound of the ocean crashing against the cliffs, mirroring the furious pounding in my head. I wanted to pack my duffel bag and walk to the airport right then and there. I wanted to fly back to my unit, where respect was earned in blood and sweat, not inherited in trust funds. But I stayed. I stayed because, deep down, the naive little girl inside me still hoped that if I just stood by my sister on her biggest day, my family would finally see me. I had no idea that the real explosion wasn't going to happen on a battlefield. It was going to happen 24 hours later, in the middle of the wedding reception, with 200 of New England's finest watching. The wedding day arrived with the frantic, highly orchestrated energy of a military deployment, though the stakes were vastly different. Instead of coordinating medevac routes, my mother was barking orders into a headset about the placement of 5,000 imported white orchids. The venue was an opulent, historic mansion in Newport, featuring vaulted ceilings, crystal chandeliers the size of small cars, and a guest list that read like a directory of the Fortune 500. I spent the morning being poked, prodded, and painted by a team of makeup artists who treated my sun-damaged skin as a personal affront to their profession. Then came the dress. The heavy mauve chiffon felt like a straitjacket. The long, restrictive sleeves clung to my arms, trapping the mid-July humidity against my skin. It was 90 degrees outside, but taking off the jacket or rolling up the sleeves was strictly forbidden by the bride. Stella, keep your arms down during the procession, Iris hissed at me just moments before the organ music began to swell. And try to smile, for heaven's sake. You look like you're marching to an execution. I'm smiling, Iris. Have a beautiful walk, I replied, forcing the corners of my mouth upward. The ceremony was flawlessly executed, a picture-perfect display of wealth and aesthetic perfection, but the real torture began at the reception. The grand ballroom was a sea of bespoke tuxedos and designer gowns. Waiters in white gloves circulated with trays of caviar and vintage champagne. Once again, I was seated at a secondary table near the kitchen doors, far away from the elevated platform where my parents, the bride and groom, and Charles's elite family sat in a display of unified superiority. I picked at my filet mignon, enduring the relentless, thinly veiled insults from my tablemates. Aunt Caroline had apparently made it her mission to ensure I knew my place. It's just such a shame you couldn't find a nice specialty, Stella, Caroline said loudly, sipping her third gin and tonic. Dermatology, perhaps, or pediatrics. Instead, you're out there in the dirt. I suppose someone has to do the grueling, unsophisticated work. I set my fork down, the metallic clink sharp against the fine china. Trauma surgery isn't unsophisticated, Aunt Caroline. It's the difference between life and death. The techniques we develop in the field often rewrite the civilian medical textbooks your doctors rely on. Caroline rolled her eyes, fanning herself with a linen napkin. Oh, please. Let's not pretend patching up soldiers is the same as Charles's work. He operates on CEOs and senators. He's a chief of surgery. You're just, well, you're a public servant. There's no prestige in it. The blatant disrespect made my blood boil, but I swallowed my anger, taking a slow sip of water. I wasn't going to ruin my sister's wedding. I had survived mortar fire. I could survive my aunt's venom. Suddenly, the jazz band stopped playing, and the distinct tapping of a spoon against crystal echoed through the cavernous room. The chatter died down as my father, Arthur Higgins, stood up at the head table. He adjusted his silk tie, his face flushed with triumph. "Family, friends, distinguished guests," my dad began, his booming voice echoing through the microphone. "Thank you all for being here to celebrate the union of two magnificent families. When I look at Iris and Charles today, I see perfection. I see the culmination of everything Beatrice and I have worked for." He paused, gesturing broadly toward Charles, who was sitting quietly, his hands resting on the table. "As a father, you only want the best for your daughters," Dad continued, his tone swelling with dramatic flair. "And let me tell you, when Iris brought Charles home, I could have wept with joy. Finally, a real medical professional in the family." The room erupted into appreciative laughter. My mother clapped enthusiastically. I felt the collective gaze of several relatives snap toward my table. "We all know the Higgins family has its eccentricities," my father chuckled, looking directly at me for a split second before turning back to the crowd. "Some of us choose paths that are a bit more rugged, a bit more blue-collar. But Charles? Charles represents the pinnacle of society. He saves lives in civilized society, not rolling around in the mud and the sand. He is a man of prestige, of intellect, and of true value. To Charles and Iris." "To Charles and Iris," the room chanted back, raising their glasses. I sat frozen. The humiliation was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. It wasn't just a casual slight. It was a public execution of my character, my career, and my entire life's purpose, broadcasted to 200 of the most influential people in New England. My throat tightened, and a familiar stinging heat pricked the back of my eyes. I looked down at the heavy, stifling sleeve covering my burn scar. I had hidden my wounds to make them comfortable. I had sat in the corner to make them comfortable. I had diminished my entire existence to ensure their shallow, gilded world remained untarnished. No more. I pushed my chair back. The legs scraped harshly against the hardwood floor. I didn't care if I caused a scene. I was going to pack my duffel bag, call a cab, and go back to a world where honor actually meant something. But just as I stood up, another voice boomed through the speakers. "Arthur, hold on a moment. I'd like to say a few words." I froze. It was Charles. The groom had taken the microphone from my father's hand. Charles Harding stood tall at the center of the head table. The charming, polite smile he had worn all weekend was completely gone. In its place was an expression of cold, formidable authority. The room, sensing the sudden shift in atmosphere, fell into a dead, breathless silence. "Arthur," Charles began, his voice dangerously calm, amplifying through the ballroom. "I want to thank you for your kind words. I am incredibly proud of the career I've built. But I need to correct a fundamental misunderstanding that has been allowed to fester in this room." My father chuckled nervously, looking around at the confused guests. "Charles, my boy, I was just making a little joke." "It wasn't funny," Charles cut him off, his voice cracking like a whip. "You spoke about prestige. You spoke about real doctors. You praised me for saving lives in civilized society." Charles shook his head slowly, a look of profound disgust crossing his features. "I fix ACLs for tennis players. I do hip replacements for bankers. I am a good surgeon, but I am not the best surgeon in this room. Not by a long shot." Iris grabbed Charles's sleeve, her face pale. "Charles, what are you doing? Stick to the script." Charles gently but firmly pulled his arm away from his new wife. He stepped out from behind the head table and walked slowly toward the center of the dance floor, his eyes scanning the crowd until they locked onto me. I was still standing by my chair, my heart hammering against my ribs. Most of you know my family comes from a long line of wealth, Charles addressed the crowd, his voice echoing in the silent room. What Arthur and Beatrice didn't bother to ask about, because they were so blinded by my bank account, is my family's legacy. My grandfather was a lieutenant general in the army. My father is a retired admiral. A murmur of shock rippled through the elite crowd. My parents exchanged a horrified, bewildered look. Service to this country is the bloodline of the Harding family, Charles continued, his voice growing louder, commanding the space. And 5 years ago, my younger brother James enlisted as a Navy corpsman. He wanted to be on the front lines. He wanted to save lives where it mattered most. Charles paused, taking a deep breath. His eyes never left mine. 2 years ago, James was attached to a forward surgical team in Kabul. Charles's voice trembled slightly, the raw emotion bleeding through his composed exterior. A medical supply generator malfunctioned and exploded. The blast leveled the surgical tent. James was trapped under the burning debris, unconscious, his gear melting to his skin. The fire was so intense that the base firefighters ordered a full retreat. They said it was a lost cause. My breath hitched. The room began to spin. The memory of the blistering heat, the screaming alarms, the smell of burning plastic and jet fuel rushed back to me with violent clarity. James, the young kid from Massachusetts who talked too much about his brother's Porsche. I had never connected the last names. In the chaos of war, he was just Doc Harding. A retreat was ordered, Charles repeated, his voice dropping to a fierce, reverent whisper. But the commanding trauma surgeon refused to leave her team behind. Without any protective gear, she sprinted into a wall of fire. She found my brother. She dragged a 200-pound unconscious man through a burning inferno, suffering third-degree burns up her own arm in the process. She collapsed the moment they cleared the blast radius, but she didn't let him go. Tears were freely streaming down the faces of several guests. My mother had a hand clamped over her mouth, her eyes wide with terror and sudden, crushing realization. My father looked physically sick. That surgeon, Charles said, pointing directly at me, is Major Stella Higgins. The entire room turned to look at me. 200 pairs of eyes, previously filled with pity or disdain, now stared at me in absolute awe. "Arthur," Charles snapped, turning back to my father, his voice dripping with venom. "You mocked her for being in the dirt. Beatrice, you forced her to wear long sleeves today to hide her unsightly scars. You made her hide the very scars she earned saving my little brother's life. Charles, we didn't know," my mother stammered, her voice shaking, her pristine makeup beginning to run. "You didn't care to know," Charles roared, the sound echoing off the crystal chandeliers. "You treated a decorated war hero, a woman who holds the Silver Star for gallantry in action, like a nuisance because she doesn't drive a luxury car. You want to talk about value? You want to talk about prestige? Your daughter is a titan. She is a giant among men, and you are entirely too small to understand her." The silence that followed was absolute. No one dared to breathe. Then, movement from the Harding family table caught my eye. A young man, walking with a slight limp and leaning on a sleek black cane, stepped out of the shadows. He was wearing a sharp, tailored suit, but his posture was unmistakable. It was James, the corpsman. He had survived. He had recovered. James walked slowly toward me, stopping just a few feet away. His eyes were shining with unshed tears. He looked at my face, then down at the heavy mauve sleeve covering my left arm. "Major," James said softly, his voice cracking. "Doc Harding," I whispered back, a rogue tear finally escaping and slipping down my cheek. "It's good to see you on your feet." "I owe you my life, ma'am," James said. Then, James did something that defied all wedding etiquette, all social norms, and completely shattered the fragile ego of the Newport elite. He snapped his heels together, his spine rigid, and raised his right hand in a slow, perfectly executed, razor-sharp military salute. Behind him, Charles's father, the retired admiral, stood up from his chair. He buttoned his tuxedo jacket, stood at attention, and mirrored his son's salute. Within seconds, Charles too stood at attention, his hand raised to his brow. "Doctor," Charles said, his voice ringing out clear and loud across the stunned ballroom. "That salute is for you, from my family to the greatest surgeon I will ever have the privilege of knowing." I stood trembling, my heart soaring in a way I hadn't felt in years. Slowly, with shaking hands, I reached for the cuff of my heavy, stifling sleeve. I unfastened the button. I grabbed the mauve chiffon and forcefully ripped the seam, tearing the fabric all the way up to my shoulder, exposing the thick, jagged, beautiful burn scar for the entire room to see. I didn't care about the dress. I didn't care about the aesthetic. I straightened my posture, squared my shoulders, and returned the salute with a crisp, steady hand. When the salute broke, the silence shattered. The Harding family erupted into applause, followed immediately by Charles's surgical colleagues, and then a tidal wave of clapping and cheering from the entire ballroom. It was a standing ovation. My parents sat frozen at the head table, completely isolated in their shame, watching as the high society crowd they so desperately wanted to impress turned their backs on them to applaud the daughter they had spent a lifetime trying to hide. I didn't stay for the cake. I didn't stay for the dancing. I walked out of that ballroom with my head held high, my scar proudly exposed to the cool night air. The military had taught me how to save lives, but that night, I finally learned how to save my own. Sometimes, the heaviest battles we fight aren't on the front lines, but in the places we are supposed to call home. Stella's story is a powerful reminder that true prestige isn't measured by bank accounts, zip codes, or designer labels, but by courage, sacrifice, and the scars we endure for others. If this story of undeniable respect and ultimate justice moved you, please hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe for more incredible real-life stories.